like, the verses are screaming, and then the choruses, they have a catchy singing chorus, but the singing isn't like singing like Rob Halford or something. No, it's singing like a little fucking whiny bitch like M Shadows.
What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock NBA, and today we are here to talk about metalcore, a genre that's very near and dear to my heart. I mean, sure, just like any other close relationship, we do have our disagreements, like when I make fun of all the crappy gentcore bands with generic Linkin Park choruses, or all the former crabcore bands who turned into butt rock bands that play at the 2 p.m. slot at those Red State butt rock festivals, but I promise it's all out of love. It's just like, you know, when two brothers fight or something. At the end of the day, they're still brothers. That's how I feel about metalcore. I really, truly do love metalcore like a brother, which is why today we're going to decide who are the big four of metalcore. And by big four, of course, I'm referring to the bands that they called the big four of thrash metal back in the day: Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, and Anthrax. So that begs the question, who is the Metallica of metalcore? Who is the Slayer? And most importantly, who is the Dave Mustaine of metalcore? That annoying, weirdly popular ginger who says a lot of like crazy stuff and just won't go away. Those are the questions that I will answer in this video. And yes, as you may have noticed, my background has changed. We're in the process of moving, so I am filming this from the spare bedroom at my mother-in-law's house. We're moving next week, so my usual background will be back as soon as I can. Also, before we get into it, I wanted to mention that I am now on Twitch. I'm streaming twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Also, I have a Discord, which is now up to 4,000 people. Thank you to everybody who's been part of either of those things. If you want to check either of them out, there's links to both of those in the description of this video.
This is how a perfect metal song goes, right?
First of all, let's talk about exactly what I mean when I say metalcore. Because at this point, the genre is like 30 years old, right? Are we talking about the original pioneering bands that brought together metal and hardcore like Integrity, Earth Crisis, All Out War, and Converge? Or are we talking about the 2010s, Rise Records, swoopy-haired bands like Of Mice and Men, Asking Alexandria, or the Devil Wears Prada, as I like to call them, boy bands with breakdowns? Or are we talking about the current generation of bands moving the genre forward like Spirit Box, Crystal Lake, and Era? Any of those are potentially valid answers, but for this video, I'm going to focus on the bands that really put the genre on the map, just like the Big Four did for thrash back in the 80s. The bands that were part of that mid-2000s explosion, when Ozfest, Guitar Hero, and Headbangers Ball were the kingmakers, when Sharon Osbourne reigned supreme over the entire metal scene. And so with all of that in mind, the first question is, who is the Metallica of metalcore? The band whose success, influence, and longevity just really dwarfs everybody else's. Well, I think there's actually a few potential candidates here. The first name that comes to mind is Bring Me the Horizon. It's kind of crazy to think about their trajectory, how they went from being this little English MySpace hype band that everybody kind of laughed at, to slowly but surely over the years getting to where they are now of being like really a semi-mainstream rock band. They've hit the Billboard Top 10 3 times in the UK, 4 times in Australia, once here in the US. They play to just massive crowds all over the world, and they're easily one of, if maybe not the single most influential bands of their whole generation, and they're only getting bigger with every release. All signs point to them being one of these kind of really generational, legendary kind of bands. But with that said, I wouldn't call them the Metallica of metalcore for one simple reason. They're really just not a metalcore band. They have certainly done some metalcore songs and some metalcore albums, yes.
This is eternal. Will we ever see the end?
But they've also done everything from deathcore to pop to rock to just like weird ambient music. So I really have a hard time calling them metalcore. Another band where I think you could make the case for being the Metallica of metalcore is Avenged Sevenfold. For one, the band is obviously just massive. They have 5 platinum albums, 4 Billboard Top 10 albums, and at their peak, they were like legit semi-mainstream stars. They were all over TRL, that MTV show that was kind of like the staple for teenagers to find new music and stars when they got home from school. They won the MTV VMA a Viewer's Choice Award in 2006. And I think they've made a pretty big impact on the world of guitar as one of these bands that kind of made it cool to play shreddy guitar again. But again, the reason why I can't really call them the Metallica of metalcore is because they're not really a metalcore band. They're really just a straight up metal band. They really only have one album that I think you could call metalcore, Sounding the Seventh Trumpet, where it really has all the staple elements of the genre like screaming and breakdowns. The rest of their music I would kind of almost describe as like a turbocharged progressive version of Guns N' Roses. I'm a huge fan of the band. I absolutely love them, but for that reason, I would say that they're disqualified here. And so with all of that being said, when someone asks who is the Metallica of metalcore, I think there's one and only one band that deserves this spot, and that is Killswitch Engage.
This is my curse. This is my curse.
Because when you think of metalcore, meaning like the fusion of hardcore and metal, they're really the band that put that on the map in the way that we think of it today. They basically took the groove and aggression of 90s hardcore like Hatebreed, mixed that with the riffs of In Flames and Children of Bodom, and boom, there you go. That is the template for what at the time was an incredibly fresh, different sound that really took over the whole scene for the better part of a decade. And I think that they filled a really important slot of being one of those bands that was the entry point for a huge chunk of kids to get into metal, because they had that kind of combination that a lot of those gateway bands do of being heavy and like a legitimately good band, but still accessible. Another big thing is that as far as I'm aware of, they were the first legit metalcore band to get any kind of like semi-mainstream radio airplay back when radio was a really big deal. Their song in Guitar Hero, I think, was another big thing. But what's really impressive and Metallica-like to me about this band is their longevity. I think for a lot of us who are a little bit older, you know, we might think of their peak as being the mid-2000s, like 2006 or so, but that's actually not true. They've released 4 Billboard Top 10 albums since then. I think they're sitting around 2 million monthly listeners on Spotify. I don't know. I think it's pretty amazing that they've managed to stay relevant for a solid 20 years. So that is the Metallica of metalcore, but that brings us to the next question, a much trickier one to answer. Who is the Megadeth of metalcore? And this is a little bit of an imperfect comparison because in addition to being the second biggest band in thrash, I think Megadeth also sucks. And I don't think the bands I'm going to talk about here suck, but you get the idea. And there's actually quite a few potential contenders here. Let me go through a few. The first one that comes to mind to me is Bullet For My Valentine. A very solid band that I think is a little bit more successful than a lot of people may realize, at least over here in America. It's easy to kind of sleep on them, but they have consistently been putting out Billboard Top 10, Top 20 albums in both America and Europe, and they're still going strong. There's really no signs of them slowing down. But still, I would disqualify them from being the Megadeth of metalcore for 2 reasons. Number one, they've kind of turned into being a little bit more of like a butt rock band than a metalcore band in my eyes. And number 2, I wouldn't say that they're especially influential. Yes, they probably were a gateway band for a certain amount of kids, but I don't really hear people bring them up as like an influence on the newer generation of bands. So for that reason, I would pass on them. Another name that came up a lot when I asked about this on Twitter was August Burns Red. And for good reason, because the band is great, and actually they do better than I think a lot of people may realize. They've hit the Billboard Top 10 4 times in their career, which is crazy for like a just pure straight up metalcore band that has never compromised at all or tried to go commercial. They won a Grammy in 2014, which again is crazy. Still don't really know how that happened, but they definitely deserved it. It was cool to see. And they've definitely been very influential. This is a band that you hear come up all the time when you ask bands about their influences. August Burns Red is consistently at the top of that list. But I would say that they're a little bit too late for the context of this discussion. They came out in 2005, which wasn't super late, but it was after Killswitch Engage and some of the other bands came along and really opened the doors for them. So respect to August Burns Red, but I think for that reason, we've got to disqualify them from this particular conversation. And there's also Lamb of God, who are a metalcore band in the sense that they're guys from the punk scene that play metal.
Did you want to play punk? Like,
yes, I thought it was going to be the South's version of Johnny Rotten. Somehow I wound up in a metal band.
There you go.
It doesn't make sense.
And I think their punk roots are kind of oftentimes overlooked, but I remember buying their first release, at least I think it was their first release back in 98, I think, when they were still called Burn the Priest. They put out a split 7-inch with an awesome grindcore power violence band called Agents of Satan. They've kind of become more part of the Ozfest Mayhem sort of scene, but their roots are absolutely in the DIY punk scene. But like I said, I think they've kind of ended up sort of just becoming part of the straight up metal scene rather than metalcore, so I'm gonna leave them out of this one. And I would also say the same of Trivium, a band that was definitely branded as being a gay scene metalcore band when they came out, but I think have successfully pivoted to becoming quote unquote real metal at this point in their career. And so if I had to choose one band as the Megadeth of metalcore, that band would be As I Lay Dying, who I think of as kind of the counterpoint to Killswitch Engage, in the same way as Megadeth was like the counterpoint to Metallica. If Killswitch was like 90s metallic hardcore with melodeath riffs to break it up, As I Lay Dying was kind of the opposite. They were basically just at the gates riffs with hardcore inspired breakdowns kind of shoved in. I feel like by the mid-2000s, metalcore was kind of divided up into those two lanes. Basically, it depended on what band you were copying. Were you going for that Killswitch kind of sound that's slower, more melodic, and more radio-friendly? Or were you copying that As I Lay Dying style that was a lot heavier and more aggressive? It's kind of interesting to me that although absolutely everybody knows As I Lay Dying, they're like, you know, universally acknowledged, kind of feel like people don't really recognize their influence that much. I would almost argue that they were the transition band between this era of metalcore and the next one. Like if you listen to early Devil Wears Prada, it's kind of just As I Lay Dying, but with synths and more emo clean parts. And just like Megadeth, they have, let's just say, a very polarizing frontman. If you guys have watched my other videos, you know my feelings on this. I think it's absolutely fucked that there's so many people that forgive Tim for what he did, but it is what it is. And it certainly makes Megadeth look better by comparison. I mean, say what you want about Dave Mustaine. He certainly says a lot of dumb shit about Obama staging mass shootings and possibly being an African Muslim or whatever, but at least he didn't try to murder his wife. So there's that. So that is the Megadeth of metalcore. And before I move on to the Slayer of metalcore, a very important and contentious discussion, I want to just pause for a minute and mention a few groups of bands that I'm sure people are going to bring up in the comments and explain why I didn't include them. First of all is all those OG metalcore bands of the 90s that I mentioned before. For example, like Integrity, Earth Crisis, Overcast, 18 Visions, Poison the Well, all that stuff. I love all those bands. I like literally grew up listening to and seeing these bands. That list of bands like is my teenage years and early 20s. And those bands most certainly opened the doors for everybody that came after them, but those bands are all years before the era that I'm focusing on in this video, and I kind of wouldn't really call them metalcore, really. I mean, that wasn't a term back then. Nobody said metalcore. Those were just a bunch of hardcore kids that listened to a lot of Prong and Slayer and tried to copy the riffs. So to me, those aren't really metalcore bands, they're just hardcore bands. The second group of bands, which is a little bit closer to what I'm talking about here, is that whole generation of bands like Unearth, God Forbid, Darkest Hour, and Shadows Fall, because this was kind of really the beginning of an actual metalcore scene that existed more or less in parallel to the hardcore scene. There was some overlap, but I would say that they were different things. And so, with all of that being said, that brings us to a very important question. Who is the Slayer of metalcore? And to kind of frame the question a little bit more, the way I think about Slayer is possibly the most influential of the big four. I know it might sound crazy, but hear me out. Obviously, we've got to talk about Metallica. Their influence is huge, but I would say that Slayer is a band that I hear more directly ripped off. Like, literally anybody in any sort of metal or metallic hardcore band of any kind has copied Slayer whether they know it or not. That style of riffing is just so distinct and so cool that I think all of us have borrowed from it at some point or another. And so the way I'm looking at it here is what metalcore band has that same kind of outsized, almost universal influence to the point where people maybe don't even realize that they're doing it. Under Oath is one name that comes to mind. They were certainly massively influential. I mean, I made a whole video talking about this the other week, so clearly I believe that they're an important band, but I would kind of consider them more post-hardcore than metalcore. And another one is the Devil Wears Prada, who, along with Attack Attack, I think, really created the template for essentially essentially the whole generation of Rise Records bands who took the breakdown heavy kind of sound of the previous generation of metalcore bands, but added synths and even more poppy, accessible, clean vocal parts. They're a little bit more on the emo side of things, I guess you would say. So definitely an influential band that deserves all the credit in the world for that, but I would say are part of the generation that's a few years after what I'm talking about in this video. And so for that reason, I'm going to disqualify them. And so my answer to this question of who is the slayer of metalcore, I'm going to go with a potentially controversial pick here, and I'm going to go with Architects.
We're just a bunch of fucking animals.
You might think of them as a newer band because it's really kind of only in the last 5 or 6 years that they've blown up, but they've actually been around since 2004, so they're almost 20 years old. As of now, they're sitting at 1.7 million Spotify listeners. Feels like they're really on the verge of breaking through to that next level of maybe Bring Me the Horizon kind of status. And I think that's pretty inspiring. To me, that's an example of what happens when you have a vision and you just keep grinding and grinding for years like they have. Very humble, very hardworking band. And I think it's really cool to see all that work paying off. And you might be surprised to hear me say that because I've talked a ton of shit about all the bands that rip off Architects because, well, there are a lot of bands that do it. And I just think it's kind of funny and sad to see them just blatantly ripped off so much. But I want to be clear that when I say that stuff, none of that is an indictment of Architects. I have tremendous respect for this band. They deserve all the credit in the world for what they've accomplished, and I'm sure that they find it just as frustrating as I do that when you look at the 2020s metalcore scene, basically it sounds like half of them heard the Doomsday riff and were like, oh hey, let's just do that from now on. So the way that I think about it is kind of like this. Like if Raining Blood was the defining riff of 90s metalcore and all of Slaughter of the Soul was kind of like the defining thing of 2000s metalcore, then the Doomsday riff is that for 2020s metalcore. And it's not even just the riffs. Like you also hear a lot of people emulating Sam Carter's style of pitched screaming in his vocals, but I just don't think anybody does it as well as he does. It's kind of hard to put my finger on it, but I just kind of feel like there's this certain sense of like raw emotion and angst, I guess, like in sincerity in his vocals that I feel like is just kind of missing from all the people who try to copy it. So I know it's a little bit of a curveball here, but I'm going to stand by it. I'm going to say Architects are the slayer of metalcore. Or, I don't know, maybe Slayer are the Architects of thrash. And that brings us to the final question, who is the Anthrax of metalcore? In my opinion, Anthrax is easily the most underrated band of the big four. Probably because they put out quite a few kind of watered down, uninspired albums in the 90s and sort of made a lot of people lose interest in the band. But their early stuff, all the Joey Belladonna stuff is fucking great. It's just full of sick chug riffs. If you haven't checked it out, I would highly encourage you to do so. And as far as their metalcore equivalent, well, I see a few candidates. The first one that comes to mind is All That Remains, who I think kind of started as sort of like the halfway point between Killswitch and As I Lay Dying. They had the speed and the heaviness and the chugs of As I Lay Dying, but with those big, accessible, like hard rock choruses of Killswitch. Some of their early stuff now sounds a little bit dated because of the production, but the songs I think are really solid. So I think they're an excellent band, but I'm gonna disqualify them here because they just kind of never really broke out of that level in the way that As I Lay Dying or Killswitch did. But before we move on, let's just take a minute to say rest in peace to Ollie. Another potential candidate here is A Day to Remember. They sort of share that thing with Anthrax of their early stuff being great, full of awesome chugs and breakdowns, but then kind of going a little bit more in the radio rock direction on their follow-up albums.
My friends are degenerates, but I never change them.
The band has been super successful commercially, they've been super influential, they're one of my personal favorite bands of all time, but I'm not really sure that you can call them metalcore. They certainly have some metalcore elements in their music and maybe a couple songs that you could call just straight up metalcore, but they're just as much pop punk or straight up alternative rock as they are metalcore, so for that reason, I'm gonna disqualify them. And so with all of that being said, the band that I think of as the Anthrax of metalcore is Parkway Drive. And again, just like Architects, they've been around for almost 20 years, but it's only in the last 7 or 8 years that I feel like they've really hit their stride. And again, I think it's super cool to see all their work paying off. And it might be a little bit of a stretch, but I feel like they do have a couple important parallels to Anthrax. First of all, the kind of overall trajectory, where their first couple albums were pure heaven for all of you chugaholics.
When your lungs come low, when your last breath fails, one reflection of fatal choices.
Not necessarily reinventing the wheel or like pushing the boundaries of art, just like Anthrax wasn't with thrash. But if you just want something with a bunch of cool chug riffs and breakdowns, well, Parkway Drive's first 3 or 4 albums, they're gonna give it to you. But the real common link between Parkway Drive and Anthrax is even more simple. Shorts. I'm kind of joking, but I'm actually kind of serious here. Because one of the big things about Anthrax back in the day was their image, especially by like the mid to late 80s. Their image was very different than the rest of the thrash bands, where the other bands were wearing like tight black jeans and high tops and maybe like the denim battle vests. Kerry King had his like spiky leather wristband thing, whereas Anthrax became known for wearing shorts all the time and just kind of coming off like chill dudes you would see at the skate park. I know it might seem weird for shorts to be that big of a deal, but honestly, they kind of were. And I'll make a whole video about Parkway Drive one of these days, but I think shorts, or really more accurately, their image in general, was a big part of Parkway Drive's success too. I actually didn't really understand the appeal of the band until I saw their DVD that came out in 2009. I was like, why are people freaking out about this band? I mean, their music is fine, but it's not necessarily the most amazing thing I've ever heard. Why do people just fucking love this band so much? And I saw the DVD, and then it all made sense. You watch that DVD, it shows them touring around and sleeping in a van and just hanging out, being bros, and you get it. You know, they just come off as the most chill, down-to-earth guys from this little out-of-the-way surf town in Australia who somehow managed to cross the world playing metalcore, and you're like, you know what? I like those guys. I want to support them. I saw that and I just instantly liked their music like 5 times more. And I think you really have to give them credit for being ahead of the curve in what people nowadays would call content marketing. So there you have it. My picks for the big 4 of metalcore. As always, let me know what you think in the comments. Make sure you check me out on Twitch if you haven't. I'm streaming twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays. There's a link to that in the description of the video. Join my Discord if you haven't. We're up to 4,000 people now. And as always, I want to thank everybody who supports us on Patreon, especially those of you who support at the True Cult level or above. Patrons get every podcast a week early. There are patron-only channels in the Discord that I'm super active in. I do Q&As, I do giveaways. There's a way to have me review your music or artwork or podcast or anything else that you'd like to get my eyes or ears on. So if any of that sounds cool to you, you can check out the Patreon at the link in the description of this video. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.